Columbus County, North Carolina is a very rural part of the state. The kind of place where someone could think they could cover up something that was really bad. At 9:15 p.m., 911 gets a call of a fire and the fire department responds. It appears to be an abandoned structure that's been there for maybe 50 or 60 years, and now it's destroyed. And there are objects in the building, including a mattress that is burned. A fireman sees an object he thinks could be a pumpkin. He realizes it's a human head. It has teeth and hair and eyes. House fires do not dismember bodies. This much is obvious. We're dealing with one sick individual.
My name's Nick Deming. I'm a special agent with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. I wanted a job that wasn't routine. Law enforcement's not a routine job.
The state only hires the best people because they are looking for the best people. Deming's been a detective for 10 years and is now working for the SBI out of Jacksonville, North Carolina. I met Nick Deming. He's a great guy and he is sharp. He knows his business.
That day, I was with my coworker. I get a call about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, it's Deming.
There was body parts located in a burned barn in Columbus County, about 2 hours away. We drop everything and head their way.
Deming gets a call about this grisly scene over in Columbus County. Dismembered body parts set on fire? This is not your average assignment.
When I arrived at the scene, I remember it was still smoldering.
The sickly, sweet odor of burned flesh. The stench is a hard, hard thing to deal with.
You treat everything really as a death investigation. You don't form the opinion of suicide, homicide right out the gate. But here in this particular case, I certainly want to treat it like a homicide.
Their arms and legs were scattered around throughout the debris.
Whoa, guys, down.
Once we moved a piece of wall, we found the second torso.
Hey, detective, you're gonna want to see this.
It took it to a different level.
Wait a minute. Now we have two victims. Dismemberment is an incredibly evil thing to do. To kill is not enough. You are so filled with hate, you want to destroy the identity of this individual. Even animals don't kill like that. Animals kill to survive. They don't do so because they enjoy it. Only humans do that.
At this point, I don't know if the victims were murdered here or dumped here.
Agent Deming is faced with a question. Did this crime occur here, or is it just dump the remains, set them on fire, and run away? Odds are very good this is a dump site, not a murder site. To control two living people and get them in this building is not an easy thing to do. But it's very easy if they're already dead and already dismembered.
When we arrived at the scene of the barn, we had nothing. No victim identification, and certainly no suspect.
When you arrive at a scene that's been destroyed by fire, it's frustrating because you're already behind the 8 ball and the investigation has not even begun. There's no evidence for you to find. It's already been destroyed.
We stayed on scene with investigators throughout the night and assisted with removing the body remains.
Who are these people? Where did they come from? Are they related, or are they two separate murders? We need to figure out what happened.
We're just here to ask you a couple questions about the house fire.
To get some answers to those thousands of questions we have,
Did you happen to see anything?
we start knocking on doors. We start trying to get a timeline of when the fire was started.
Were you home around 5:30 p.m.? yesterday?
Deming tries for a canvas in this area, but there's hardly anyone that lives here. The person that saw the flames and called it in was merely a passerby. There are no surveillance cameras. This is rural North Carolina. Mother Nature is the only witness to this.
When I was at the crime scene, I overheard that 2 females were missing out of Wilmington. I was thinking that was a good distance away from where we were at in Columbus County, but it's definitely something that we wanted to follow up with.
Sunday, April 2nd, 2017, in Wilmington, North Carolina. Reverend Blevins is greeting his Sunday morning parishioners.
Eva Jo Jones and Tiffany Cartwright were there every single Sunday. On this particular Sunday, we noticed that they were not there. That for them was very unusual. On Monday morning, I had gotten a text message asking me if I had heard from Eva and Tiffany over the weekend.
We really need to check on them. We then said, well, let's just drive over to the apartment.
They find the place locked up. Eva and her daughter Tiffany have never missed a church service in years. Everything about this is alarming to them.
We went to the manager. We asked him if we could go in with him. And so he opened the door. It smelled very clean, like some type of disinfectant. We went all the way down the hall. Everything was absolutely spotless. Everything was put in perfect order. There was not a dish in the sink. There was nothing. Like they had just packed their bags and left. I just knew something wasn't right. So I called the Wilmington Police Department and reported them missing.
Wilmington PD responds to the apartment, finds the place neat and tidy. Everything here had the appearance of total normalcy. Nothing to see here, folks. And yet something here just isn't right. Where are these people? Why did they tell anybody where they were going?
So I realized that we have 2 ladies missing out of Wilmington, and we have potentially 2 human remains that were found in a barn. Due to the fire damage, our best hope was to reach out to the Wilmington PD and get the dental records to identify the human remains.
The coroner's office determines that the bodies discovered in the barn are, in fact, Tiffany Cartwright and her mother, Eva Jones. When you see a case like this where the violence is extreme, it's personal. This is not some random act by a lunatic. This perpetrator is intent on covering his tracks. Demi knows this, but no one can be careful enough to stop a good detective. Agent Deming now knows the identity of these two unfortunate souls who were discovered dismembered and burned to a crisp. No one in their hometown of Wilmington knows that yet. As far as they know, these women are still missing.
Prayer after prayer, going up tonight for Eva Jones and her daughter, Tiffany Cartwright. No one's heard from the mother and daughter since Friday. Both missed Saturday doctor appointments and Sunday service at Life Community Church. Their car gone, their phones going straight to voicemail. Now their church, that's more like family, just wants them found.
Wilmington PD is now aware of who these people are and report to Harriet at their church, the woman who reported them missing in the first place.
When I heard the bodies were dismembered, I don't think I have ever felt so sick and so, it was just an awful feeling.
Here we are in an investigation where a mother and her daughter are found brutally murdered, dismembered, and set on fire. Who would want to do them harm? Someone certainly did.
At that point, we don't know too much about them because we were kind of almost working two separate investigations until we hit that overlap. But Wilmington PD had spoken to friends from the church, people in the community.
I met Eva and Tiffany pretty soon after they came to the church. They were there every single Sunday.
Eva is 60 years old and is employed in a legal office in Wilmington. Her daughter Tiffany is 35 and is a custodian at a local elementary school. They live together in an apartment.
I did get to know both of them. Eva particularly, she just had such a sweet spirit about her. And Tiffany, she was great. She was quieter. She served in our ministries. They both were amazing people.
Law enforcement always talks to the next of kin to figure out who else might be involved in this story. Wilmington PD told me that they had spoken to Eva Jo Jones's other daughter, Sarah.
Sarah has now moved out of state after separating from her husband and now lives in Ohio.
On that Thursday during the day, Sarah made her trek from Ohio in her car to Wilmington, and she came straight to the church.
Wilmington PD met Sarah at the church and informed her that her mother and her sister were deceased.
To the police's credit, they didn't want her to be alone at that moment. And so we met at our church and they shared the tragic news with her. And it was a moment. I hope I never have to sit in a moment like that again.
Watching a human being absorb that kind of news, it was traumatic to me. I can't imagine how traumatic it was for Sarah. Just what do you do with all that pain? Where do you put all of that?
Sarah is, of course, devastated by this news. They inquire of Sarah who might want to do them harm.
Any issues with anybody?
Sarah says no one. They're the nicest people in the world. The usual story. No one has threatened them in any way, nor are there any difficulties with anyone.
I knew, based off the dismembered bodies, that this is going to be some linked to a crime of passion. It's going to be linked to a potential anger, sadness, all sorts of emotions that just built up.
Affairs of the heart produce emotions like nothing else. People get really distressed when they believe they're being rejected. This produces rage, and rage becomes revenge, and revenge becomes murder. Who are they romantically involved with? How did that come to an end? Did somebody monkey with somebody else's monkey? That's always a problem. Eva is 60 years old, but she is single. They asked, does she date people? And they say, no, not recently. Okay, what about her daughter, Tiffany? Well, she has an ex-boyfriend. They broke up. Oh, really? Their friends know him as Ben Chapman. They dated for a period of time, and now they don't anymore. No one knows much more about them than that. But it's a name, and it gives Deming a place to go.
Thank you for meeting with us.
Who are you, Ben? And what do you have to do with this, if anything?
And I've seen it in my training and had experienced that a lot of times it's a breakup with a girlfriend. Could be that thing that triggers that person to take a life.
Deming is considering how to approach Ben and identifying where he's currently located when he's contacted by the coroner's office with the results of the autopsy.
The medical examiner's report came out, and the findings were horrific. You got blunt force trauma, dismembered bodies, removal of the limbs, and decapitation. This is some dark stuff.
What's the cause of death? Well, take your pick. There's probably 20 causes of death in there. These people weren't just dismembered, they were tortured. The hate that this person feels never dissipates during this entire process. He's having the time of his life killing these people.
A lot of times a straw that breaks the camel's back could be learning of infidelity, somebody leaving, a partner, betrayal could play a big factor in there.
Ben is an ex-boyfriend. How did he become an ex-boyfriend? A transgression by him or a transgression by Tiffany? Police like ex-boyfriends. They do stupid things. I've seen death by every means except a nuclear weapon. Is this the worst murder I know about? It's certainly in the top 10. I've had worse, but not many. In this case, we're talking about the dismemberment of 2 women and set on fire. Could it be that Tiffany's ex-boyfriend, Ben Chapman, be the person who did that? He's certainly worthy of further inquiry. They find nothing about him to be suspicious in any way. All his friends and associates say that he is a wonderful person.
In a lot of cases, the ex-boyfriend or girlfriend can be a great source of information, but in this case, it wasn't a help.
When you're looking for someone that has this level of violence in them, you assume that they have an extensive criminal record. Ben Chapman doesn't have one. His demeanor does not match someone who is capable of doing what was done to these 2 women. Ben Chapman didn't do this. Someone else did. At this point, we're spinning our wheels somewhat. They haven't even established the location of the crime scene yet. They know where body parts were dumped, but that's not where these murders took place.
We always want to find the scene of the crime. That way we can locate more evidence. That way we can help determine through that evidence who was there, maybe even who wasn't there.
So the scene is still out there, and Deming knows it. Where is it? It's likely it's their apartment, despite what the police say they observed when they were in there. So let's go back and look again.
Detectives go back to the apartment to see if anything's there that they might have missed. They locate Eva's purse and phone.
Now that's interesting. Just one victim's phone was discovered in their apartment, Eva's. But where is Tiffany's? Demi needs to figure that out, and fast.
Cell phone records are great because the cell phone provider will give us the location of where the cell phone was last used.
So while they wait for answers from the cell phone company, the investigators carry out a full forensic workup of the victim's apartment. There's a factor involved in physical evidence of a violent crime. It's called blood. Blood has a habit of showing up in the darndest places, even after time.
Crime scene investigators are highly trained individuals. They got more chemicals, they have these fancy lights, they have all sorts of equipment that can help them develop leads and collect evidence at a crime scene a normal cop couldn't gather.
Blood is a curious thing. It's a viscous liquid. It's not like water. It's thick. And eventually it's going to seep back to the surface. On this occasion, they see something they didn't see 3 days ago. Now they see a faded crimson stain on the carpet. They block all the windows. They hose the place down with luminol. And it lights up. There is blood everywhere. Blood in the bathtub, blood in the bathroom. Blood in the carpet.
Finding this amount of blood tells us that somebody could have been killed in this apartment. Today's technology with DNA, if there's a large loss of blood, it's going to be extremely hard to get rid of it all. So you're trying to figure out what else isn't here that should be here. There's hacksaw marks on the bathtub, and that could have played a role in how the bodies were dismembered. There was a brand new shower curtain placed in the bathroom, which by itself isn't necessarily anything, but when you start combining all these other factors, it's pretty significant. At this point in the investigation, with no signs of forced entry, it's somebody that had access that they willingly let into the house.
So now we're getting somewhere at last. Deming now needs Tiffany's cell phone records back, because they're the next piece of this puzzle.
Great, thanks.
Location data can tell you a great deal about a cell phone. In the case of Eva Jones, the last location ping on her phone was on the doorknob in her apartment. She didn't go anywhere. In the case of her daughter, Tiffany, when they get those results back, it's a total mystery.
We learned through investigation at Wilmington PD that Tiffany's last ping was in Myrtle Beach.
So what is Tiffany's phone doing in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina? We need to go back to the victim's relatives and friends to find out what connection, if any, they had to that location.
We knew that Sarah, Eva's other daughter, had lived in the Myrtle Beach, South Carolina area.
So Wilmington police talked to Sarah to figure out who else might be involved in this story.
We were married for about 2
One of the persons she mentioned was her estranged husband, Jeffrey.
Sarah, the surviving daughter, is going through a divorce with her husband, with whom she had 2 kids. The husband's name is Jeffrey Harmon.
Got divorced recently.
Sarah has left Jeffrey and is currently living in Ohio.
Wanted to stay together, be a family. I didn't.
She says Jeffrey is hoping they'll get back together, but she has no plans to reconcile with him.
Everybody who's in Eva and Tiffany's sphere of influence is in Wilmington except for one, Jeffrey Harmon, who lived in Myrtle Beach.
Well, Jeffrey, that's a bit of a problem now, isn't it? Tiffany's phone is pinging in your city. There's a moment in every case when something happens that is the key to something. You feel a sense of calmness come over you because the tension has left you. This is it. This is what we need. The last cell phone location ping on Tiffany's phone was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Now who lives in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina? Well, Jeffrey Harmon does. The estranged husband of Tiffany's sister, Sarah. Sarah says Jeffrey says he loves her and wants her to return to the family home. He seems to get along fine with his mother-in-law and his sister-in-law.
Jeffrey was a even keel man who volunteered with the Boy Scouts and was known to be relatively quiet.
All right. All right, thank you.
We weren't able to locate anything significant between them through domestic violence or anything of that nature.
Following the murders, the investigators had reached out to Jeffrey to tell him what had happened to his in-laws.
Wilmington spoke to Jeffrey Harmon, who said he hadn't seen Tiffany or Eva since Christmas and he had no plans to see them.
When Wilmington PD spoke to Jeffrey Harmon, he told them his mother-in-law and sister-in-law did not want to be involved in their marital problems.
When police talked to Sarah, she gave them the same story.
So that account is all confirmed. But surprise, surprise, it's not the entire story because it never is. Harriet Blevins, the wife of the minister, recalled something important.
I knew about Sarah and her husband's troubles because Eva would confide in me and others at the church to pray for Sarah. She was always very concerned for Sarah and for her children. And that she did not think that Jeff Harmon was a good guy. And she did not think he was good to Sarah. I think that Tiffany also was not happy that her sister was married to such a man.
Let's run him through the system. Find out where he lives. Well, Jeffrey, Tiffany's phone is pinging close to where you reside.
It started to click, and we at that point knew that one of the phones was down there at his residence. And it was a bold-faced lie if he said he didn't see him since Christmas.
I always loved it when people lied to me. Tell me a lie. Because if you'll lie to me, I'm talking to the right fellow. Now we have to go confront Mr. Harmon, go see him, and look him in the eye.
I'm Sergeant Jamie Jernigan. I formerly worked with the Horry County Police Department as an investigative detective in the homicide unit. April 4th, 2017, the criminal investigation unit receives the call from Wilmington PD to send out a detective to an address out on Leo Drive in Myrtle Beach. The detective attempts to make contact by knocking on the door. He checked the windows, he looked around, he didn't see anyone.
So where's Jeffrey? Is he hiding? Is he just at work? Interesting.
So he took his business card, put it in the door.
They left the business card for a reason. They want Harmon to know they were there. They want to see if it hinks him up at all.
I was at home, asleep after working a long day, and I hear the phone ring around 2 a.m. The 2 a.m. phone call is never good. It's Horry County Police Department.
Deming is on the phone with the Horry County Police Department in South Carolina. They reported they received a phone call from Jeffrey Harmon's friend.
We knew we had a problem.
The Horry County Police Department in South Carolina received a call from Jeffrey's friend, who was in Jeffrey's home. He said Jeffrey called him in a panic, so he headed over to the house. He went inside. As he approached the bathroom door, he heard a gunshot.
I arrived on scene and was immediately met by initial responding officers.
Jeffrey apparently realized the police were closing in. He did not want to face them.
There was a male subject who was found deceased in the bathtub, fully clothed, from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. With the evidence that was collected at the scene, we were able to conclude that there was no foul play, that it was in fact a suicide.
So he takes the coward's way out. He eats his gun. Now they have to obtain all the corroborating evidence, so the investigation continues.
Yes, 122.
We found the victim's jewelry in the neighbor's trash can, and victim's cell phones, multiple handguns, multiple boxes of ammunition, a notebook that was recovered that actually did contain a suicide note. And we took Jeffrey Harmon's pickup truck from the location. I believe it was a Dodge truck.
Detectives now have a good idea on how this crime took place. They don't have a perfect idea because they weren't there. The evidence would show that Sarah leaves Jeffrey, and he doesn't take that well.
Sarah told me that the relationship with her and Jeffrey was very strained. She described it as miserable, but that there was never any violence or any addiction to drugs or anything like that, just that it was an unhealthy, difficult relationship that she was looking to get out of.
Sarah left her husband, Jeffrey Harmon. Jeffrey Harmon decided it's best for vengeance to lash out at her loved ones.
Jeffrey Harmon has a psychopathic episode and decides he will torture his wife by butchering her mother and her sister. What his motivation for that is, who knows? I'm not crazy, so I don't know.
March 31st, he purchased some duct tape. Buying duct tape just sounds like there was some forethought and planning to what he was about to do. He drives his truck to the women's Wilmington apartment.
This again. I don't want you here.
Eva Jones doesn't know what his intention is that day.
I told her we don't want anything more to do. I just want to talk.
As there's no signs of forced entry,
I just want to talk.
Okay, come in.
it's believed that Eva Jo Jones let Jeffrey Harmon into their home.
Detectives believe she lets him into her apartment and he attacks and kills her. Drags her into the bathroom, into the bathtub, and chops her up, for God's sake. He can't get enough blood on him. That's how psychotic he is at this particular moment. He is out of contact with reality. Detectives believe Jeffrey then waits for the daughter Tiffany to come home. They find photos in Jeffrey's phone of Tiffany tied up and duct taped and kidnapped for a period of time.
Harmon kidnaps Tiffany and drives her back 200 miles to his residence in Myrtle Beach.
Eventually, he kills Tiffany as well and dismembers her.
Tiffany and Eva were missing for 3 days. Evidence is still unsure where Tiffany was killed or where her mother's remains were held during this time. But what we know, he takes the remains to an abandoned barn and sets the barn on fire.
He then proceeds to try to cover up what he's done. Clean up the apartment, vacuum the blood out of the entry hall. All the different tricks that he thinks will absolve him of guilt in this matter. He returns home. He thinks he has a plan. It comes unraveled when detectives close in. When panic sets in, your worst enemy is your mind. He can't face that. He's a tough guy when he's faced with two small women he can overcome. But he's not truly a tough guy. He's just a nutcase. So now he chooses self-destruction over punishment.
He called a friend. Jeffrey locked himself in the bathroom and laid in the bathtub and shot himself in the head.
So long, Jeffrey. The world's a better place without people like you.
Investigation has shown he acted alone in doing this. In this case, case closed by death of offender.
You can't prosecute a dead guy, so the case is closed. Without question, this is sick. Jeffrey Harmon is one sick little boy.
6 years later, we are still grappling with the fact that something like that could happen here within our community and, our family, basically. It's just astounding. I think if I could talk to the kids or to Sarah today, that I would just really reiterate to them how much Eva and Tiffany love Sarah and those kids.
I would say that this is one of the worst I've worked. I learned some lessons from this case. Don't overlook anybody just because they're not wearing all black and a ski mask. They could easily be the guy next to you in the store. Jeffrey was known as an even-keeled Boy Scout leader, mild-mannered guy, and he was our guy.
Sarah met the wrong guy. And Eva Jones and Tiffany Cartwright died in the worst possible way as a result. Good police work nailed Jeffrey Harmon in the end. Did Jeffrey Harmon look like a murderer? No. Is he a monster? Yes. And he acted out being precisely that. A seemingly mild-mannered guy who was anything but trust no one. This case is an indication of that. Trust no one.
The rain began to fall just after midnight, thin and cold, whispering against the cracked pavement of a quiet Sydney suburb, washing neon reflections into trembling streaks of red and blue, the kind of night where even the city itself seemed to hold its breath, where shadows stretched too long, where silence pressed against the ears like a warning, and in a narrow street lined with tired brick houses and dim porch lights, a single scream tore through the darkness and vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the rain, leaving behind nothing but a shiver crawling down the spines of those who would later swear they had heard something wrong, something that refused to fade no matter how many years passed. By dawn, the street was sealed off. Yellow tape fluttered in the damp wind. Police cars idled, their engines low and constant, a mechanical heartbeat under the hushed murmurs of gathering neighbors. At the center of it all stood a modest two-story home, its windows dark, its front door ajar, as though the house itself had been caught mid-confession. Inside, investigators moved slowly, deliberately, boots tracing careful arcs across the floor, gloved hands hovering above overturned furniture, broken glass, and scattered papers. In the back bedroom, beneath a half-open window, they found her, 22-year-old Emily Carter, university student, part-time barista, a young woman with plans scribbled into notebooks, a laugh described as contagious, a future that should have been long and unremarkable. Instead, her life had ended violently, abruptly, in a room that still smelled faintly of lavender and cheap perfume. There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate weapon, no clear motive, just a brutal reality that settled like lead in the pit of every stomach present. The medical examiner would later confirm the cause of death as blunt force trauma combined with strangulation, the kind of personal violence that spoke of rage, panic, or desperation, and perhaps all three tangled together. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 in the morning, a narrow window in which the world outside continued its ordinary rhythm. Buses still ran, taxis still cruised, late-night radios still murmured, unaware that a life had been extinguished behind drawn curtains. News traveled fast. By midday, reporters clustered behind barricades, microphones thrust forward, cameras scanning for any scrap of drama, any flicker of emotion. The headlines followed within hours, stamped across the front pages of Sydney's papers in heavy black type. Young woman found murdered in Inner West home. The community reeled. Friends collapsed into tears. Neighbors locked their doors and double-checked their windows. Parents called their children, voices tight with fear. And detectives from the New South Wales Police Homicide Squad descended on the scene, bringing with them the weight of expectation and the pressure of a city that demanded answers. Emily Carter was not a stranger to anyone. She had grown up in the suburbs, excelled in school, earned a place at university, worked evenings at a small cafe near the harbor. Her routine was predictable, her circle of friends small but close-knit. She lived alone, recently moved into the house after saving for years, proud of her independence, proud of the life she was building. There were no known enemies, no turbulent relationships, no history of trouble, which made the violence of her death all the more bewildering and all the more terrifying. Investigators began where they always did, with the basics. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking about unusual sounds, unfamiliar faces, anything that might have seemed insignificant at the time. Some neighbors reported hearing a brief argument, muffled through walls, followed by a sharp cry. Others remembered nothing at all. A few mentioned a dark-colored sedan idling at the corner earlier that night, but no one could provide a plate number, a clear description, or even certainty. Memories blurred under the pressure of shock, and the rain had washed away what little physical trace might have remained outside. Inside the house, the scene offered few gifts. There were no fingerprints of value, no clear footprints, no obvious murder weapon. The struggle appeared brief but intense, suggesting the attacker was close enough to catch Emily by surprise. Her phone lay shattered near the foot of the bed. Her handbag was open, its contents scattered, yet nothing of value seemed to be missing. Cash remained in her wallet. Jewelry still adorned her dresser. Robbery did not fit. Sexual assault did not fit. The motive hung in the air, unanswered, like a question that refused to settle. Detectives turned to Emily's last known movements. That evening, she had finished her shift at the cafe just after 10. A co-worker recalled her mentioning she felt tired, that she planned to head straight home. CCTV footage showed her boarding a bus, headphones in, staring blankly out the window. Another camera caught her walking the final blocks to her house, keys already in hand. She looked alone, unfollowed, unthreatened, and then the trail simply ended. Days turned into weeks. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Friends, classmates, co-workers, former partners, acquaintances, neighbors, anyone whose life had crossed paths with Emily's, even briefly. Alibis were checked and rechecked. Tips flooded in, many vague, some wild, a few tantalizing but ultimately hollow. A man seen running through a nearby park. A stranger lingering outside a convenience store. A heated argument overheard at a party weeks earlier. Each lead was chased, dissected, and, in time, discarded. As the investigation dragged on, frustration began to set in. Senior detectives pored over case files late into the night, walls plastered with timelines, photographs, maps, strings of connection that led nowhere. The pressure mounted. Public confidence wavered. Editorials demanded progress. Talkback radio buzzed with speculation, conspiracy, fear. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone. University campuses tightened security. Emily Carter's face became a symbol of vulnerability, of randomness, of the idea that safety could evaporate without warning. Her family existed in a different kind of time, one measured in sleepless nights and endless questions. Her mother replayed their last phone conversation over and over, searching for hidden meaning in casual words. Her father stood in the doorway of her empty room, staring at posters and textbooks and half-folded clothes, trying to reconcile them with the brutal images now seared into his memory. Her younger brother withdrew, haunted by guilt for arguments that now seemed unforgivable. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went, and the silence where Emily should have been only grew louder. After 6 months, the case stalled. No arrest. No charges. No suspect strong enough to withstand scrutiny. It was officially classified as a cold case, though the word itself felt cruel, suggesting a fading of urgency that the family could never accept. Boxes of evidence were sealed, cataloged, and stored. Files were archived. Detectives were reassigned. And yet, beneath the procedural closure, the unease lingered, a collective sense that the truth remained just beyond reach. Years slipped by. Sydney changed. Buildings rose where empty lots once stood. Cafes came and went. New train lines cut across old neighborhoods. The world moved forward, but for those tied to Emily's memory, time seemed suspended, locked in the unresolved night of 1996. Occasionally, A journalist would revisit the story. A true crime program would air a somber reenactment. Tips would trickle in, sparked by fading recollections or sudden confessions, but none would survive careful examination. Then, in the early hours of a quiet autumn morning nearly 2 decades later, a phone rang inside a small police station on the outskirts of the city. The officer who answered expected nothing more than a routine call, perhaps a noise complaint, perhaps a domestic dispute. Instead, a voice on the other end, low and hesitant, uttered words that had not been spoken aloud in years. Emily Carter.
Sydney.
1996. Cold case. The caller did not give a name. The line crackled, the connection unstable. But what followed was enough to make the officer straighten in his chair, heart thudding. Details. Specific, intimate details. The layout of the house. The broken phone. The position of the body. Information never released to the public. The voice trembled, hesitated, surged forward again, as if fighting an invisible tide. When asked how they knew these things, the caller paused, breath audible, before whispering a single sentence that would shatter the stillness of the room. I was there. The line went dead. For a moment, the station seemed suspended between breaths. Then, alarms of a different kind began to sound. Files were retrieved from deep storage. Names long forgotten resurfaced. Senior detectives were called in before dawn. A case that had lain dormant for 19 years was suddenly, violently, awake. Yet, even as investigators scrambled to trace the call, to triangulate its origin, to identify the voice, uncertainty gnawed at the edges. Was this a cruel hoax? A disturbed mind seeking attention? Or the first crack in a wall of silence that had held firm for nearly 2 decades? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. And somewhere in the city, someone who had lived for years under the weight of a terrible secret had finally, impossibly, broken. Because in the shadows of that unresolved night, beyond the files and photographs and headlines, beyond the public grief and private despair, the truth had been waiting. Patient, relentless. And now, after all these years, it was beginning to stir. The recording of the anonymous call replayed again and again inside the dimly lit operations room, the voice distorted by static yet unmistakably human, trembling with an emotion that hovered somewhere between terror and release, each pause heavy, each breath sharp, as if the speaker were forcing words through a throat tightened by years of buried memory, and the detectives listened in silence, leaning forward, absorbing every syllable, every hesitation, because within that fragile thread of sound lay the possibility of finally understanding what had happened on that rain-soaked night, and perhaps even more disturbingly, why the truth had remained hidden for so long. The first priority was to trace the origin of the call. Technicians dissected phone records, triangulated signal paths, chased fleeting digital footprints across outdated infrastructure and modern networks stitched together like a technological patchwork. The caller had used a prepaid mobile phone purchased with cash, activated briefly, then discarded. A familiar tactic, a deliberate attempt to vanish. But even the most careful planning left microscopic traces. A cell tower ping placed the call within a narrow radius, a cluster of aging apartment blocks and neglected warehouses along the industrial fringe of the city. It was a starting point, nothing more, but in a case starved of beginnings, it felt monumental. Detectives fanned out before sunrise, the city still half asleep, streets slick with dew, the air carrying the faint metallic scent of rain and exhaust. They knocked on doors, spoke to early shift workers, questioned night security guards, scanned CCTV footage from corner stores and loading docks, searching for any face, any silhouette, any movement that might align with the precise minute the call had been made. Hours blurred. Leads evaporated. Frustration crept in. And yet, beneath it all, there was a renewed sense of purpose, a current of energy absent for nearly 20 years. Back at headquarters, the cold case file was reopened in full. Every photograph, every interview transcript, every scrap of forensic data was laid out once more, re-examined through the lens of possibility rather than resignation. Patterns previously dismissed were revisited. Timelines were redrawn. Old suspects resurfaced, their names whispered like echoes from a forgotten corridor. But what dominated every discussion was the voice on the recording. The unknown witness. The person who claimed to have been there. Psychological profilers analyzed the speech, its cadence, its emotional undertones. They noted the tremor when the caller described the moment Emily fell silent, the barely suppressed sob when mentioning the broken phone, the abrupt shift in tone when asked to explain their presence. This was not the voice of someone fabricating a story. This was the voice of someone haunted. Someone who had lived with a memory too heavy to carry. The revelation reignited public interest overnight. News outlets seized upon the development, resurrecting the case with relentless intensity. Headlines blazed across screens and papers. Sydney 1996 cold case revived by anonymous confession. Talkback radio lines flooded. Social media erupted with speculation, theories, accusations. Armchair detectives pored over grainy photographs and faded headlines, convinced that the answer had been hidden in plain sight all along. For Emily's family, the renewed attention was both hope and torment, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. Her parents sat side by side in their living room, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the television as anchors repeated the same limited facts, over and over, filling silence with conjecture. They had learned long ago not to trust promises, not to lean too heavily on optimism, yet the possibility that someone out there might finally tell the truth stirred something fragile inside them, a cautious flicker that refused to be extinguished. As the days passed, detectives pursued every thread connected to the call radius. Among the residents of that area were dozens of individuals whose lives intersected, however faintly, with Emily's. Former classmates, old neighbors, delivery drivers, maintenance workers. One name, in particular, surfaced repeatedly in the archived files, a man who had lived only 3 blocks from Emily's house in 1996, a man who had once come forward as a witness but whose statement had been vague, contradictory, and ultimately dismissed. His name was Daniel Harper. In 1996, Harper was 27, a freelance electrician struggling to make ends meet, known to drift from job to job, address to address. He had told police he had seen a woman arguing with a man near Emily's street shortly before midnight, but his description had been inconsistent, his timeline uncertain. Under scrutiny, his account unraveled, and he was quietly removed from the list of persons of interest. He moved shortly thereafter, vanishing into the anonymity of suburban sprawl. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Harper's name resurfaced not because of a new lead, but because of an old one that suddenly felt unfinished. Detectives traced his movements through employment records, rental agreements, and sparse financial trails, eventually locating him in a coastal town several hours north of Sydney. He lived alone in a weathered cottage, working occasional shifts as a handyman, known among neighbors as quiet, reserved, polite, and deeply private. 2 unmarked vehicles arrived at his address just after dusk. The sky was heavy with low clouds, the air thick, oppressive. Harper answered the door slowly, his eyes flicking between the unfamiliar faces, recognition flickering, then retreating behind a mask of caution. When asked about the 1996 case, his shoulders stiffened, a barely perceptible reaction, but enough. He agreed to accompany the detectives for questioning, requesting only a moment to lock his door, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the keys. The interview room was stark, fluorescent lights casting unforgiving shadows across the table. Harper sat rigid, fingers interlaced, gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the detective's shoulders. For hours, he answered routine questions, his voice flat, his manner controlled. He denied making the call, denied possessing any knowledge beyond what he had shared years earlier. But when the recording was played, when that distorted voice filled the room, something inside him shifted. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed. His eyes glistened, just for an instant, before he looked away. Silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. The detectives did not rush. They had learned that truth often surfaced in the spaces between words, in the moments when the mind could no longer sustain its defenses. Finally, Harper exhaled, long and ragged, and whispered that he needed water. When he returned, his posture had slumped, as if a physical weight pressed upon his shoulders. He began not with the night of the murder, but with the months leading up to it, with a chance encounter, a brief connection, a friendship that hovered uncertainly on the edge of something more. He spoke of meeting Emily at the cafe where she worked, of small conversations, shared jokes, the warmth of her smile. He insisted there was nothing inappropriate, nothing obsessive, but his words betrayed an intensity he seemed barely able to restrain. He described loneliness, isolation, the quiet desperation of a man watching a life unfold just out of reach. Then, slowly, haltingly, he described the night of the crime. He said he had been drinking, said he had walked aimlessly, unable to sleep, drawn by a restless energy he could not explain. Said he had found himself near Emily's house, the lights glowing faintly behind drawn curtains. He claimed he had not intended to enter, not intended to confront her, but when he saw a shadow move behind the window, something inside him fractured. He knocked. She opened the door, surprise flickering across her face, quickly replaced by caution. Words were exchanged. Tension escalated. He insisted it was a misunderstanding, a moment that spiraled out of control. Yet, as he spoke, contradictions emerged. Details clashed with the evidence. Timelines wavered. His accounts seemed rehearsed in places, raw in others, a mosaic of memory and invention that left investigators unconvinced. When confronted, Harper's composure cracked. His voice rose. His hands shook. He pressed his palms against his temples, as though trying to contain thoughts too large for his skull. He admitted to entering the house, admitted to an argument, admitted to being present when Emily fell. But he denied striking her, denied causing her death. Instead, he described a third presence, a man who had emerged from the shadows of the hallway, a stranger, aggressive, violent, whose face he could not clearly recall. Panic, he said, had overtaken him. He fled, convinced he would be blamed, convinced no one would believe his story. The room seemed to close in as detectives listened. This was not a confession, not yet. It was a fragment of truth wrapped in layers of fear and self-preservation. But it was more than they had ever had before. Harper was detained for further questioning, his home searched, his past scrutinized with renewed intensity. And as investigators worked through the night, assembling timelines, cross-referencing his statements with forensic data, a chilling realization began to take shape. If Harper was telling even part of the truth, then Emily Carter had not been alone with her killer. There had been a witness, a silent observer who had carried the burden of that night for 19 years, shaping his life around a single catastrophic moment until the weight became unbearable. And somewhere within that fractured confession lay the key to everything. Because if there had indeed been a second man, then the cold case was not merely a story of lost evidence and fading memories. It was a story of proximity, of opportunity, of betrayal. And the truth, once set in motion, would not stop until it reached its end. Night bled into morning inside the interrogation wing, the artificial glare of fluorescent lights flattening time into a single, relentless stretch as detectives worked in rotating shifts, replaying Daniel Harper's fractured narrative, dissecting each sentence, each hesitation, each contradictory detail, searching for the fault lines where truth might finally break through, because beneath his words lay something volatile, something unresolved. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the real story of that night was far darker, more tangled than anyone had imagined. Harper was transferred to a holding cell, given time to sleep, to eat, to collect himself, but rest refused to come. Surveillance cameras captured him pacing, pressing his forehead against the cold concrete wall, whispering to himself in jagged fragments. The past had risen up, clawed its way back into his present, and there was no escaping it now. By midday, he requested to speak again. This time, his voice lacked the brittle bravado of the night before. It was quieter, weighted. He admitted that parts of his earlier account had been softened, reshaped, distorted by fear. Fear of blame, fear of judgment, fear of becoming the villain in a story he had spent years rewriting in his own mind. He confirmed he had been inside the house, confirmed there had been a second man, and confirmed that he knew exactly who that man was. The name fell into the room like a dropped weapon. Marcus Bell. In 1996, Bell was 31, a casual laborer with a history of petty crime, minor assaults, and volatile behavior, a man who drifted along the edges of legality, never staying in one place long enough for consequences to catch him. He had lived in a shared boarding house 2 streets from Emily's home, crossing paths with Harper often, sometimes drinking together, sometimes clashing. Their relationship, Harper said, was built on convenience and tension, a fragile truce between 2 lonely men orbiting the same restless neighborhoods. On the night of the murder, Harper claimed Bell had been with him earlier, drinking in a dingy pub until closing time. Bell was agitated, angry about a dispute with a former employer, simmering with resentment. When they left, Harper wandered toward Emily's street, driven by an urge he barely understood. Bell followed, amused, curious, perhaps sensing drama. When Harper knocked and Emily opened the door, Bell lingered outside, hidden by shadow, listening. The argument escalated quickly. Emily, startled and upset, demanded Harper leave. Voices rose. Emotions spiraled. And then, according to Harper, Bell forced his way inside, intoxicated, unpredictable, seizing control of a situation already teetering on collapse. What followed unfolded in chaos. Shouting, struggling. A blow struck in panic or rage. A body falling. Silence that screamed louder than any cry. Harper described freezing, paralyzed by shock, as Bell stood over Emily's lifeless form, breathing hard, eyes wild. Bell, he said, barked orders, commanding him to help stage the scene, to scatter belongings, to smash the phone, to create confusion, and when Harper hesitated, Bell threatened him, promising consequences far worse than prison if he spoke. The fear took root. The silence hardened. And together, they vanished into the night, leaving behind a devastation that would echo for decades. Detectives listened, grim-faced, absorbing the magnitude of the confession. But words alone were not enough. They needed corroboration. Evidence. Something that could withstand the weight of a courtroom, the scrutiny of defense attorneys, the skepticism of a public burned too many times by false hope. They turned, once more, to the archives. Marcus Bell had been interviewed briefly in 1996, a routine canvass, his name lost among hundreds. He claimed he had been home all night, alone, watching television. No one had challenged the alibi. No one had questioned the silence of a man with no witnesses. It had been easier to accept, easier to move on. Now, investigators retraced his path through the years. Bell had left Sydney not long after the murder, drifting across regional towns, working short-term jobs, accumulating minor charges, assault, public intoxication, disorderly conduct. He had never stayed long enough to draw sustained attention. Eventually, he settled in Western Australia, marrying briefly, divorcing bitterly, then retreating into near-total isolation. At the time Harper named him, Bell was living in a remote mining community, far from the place where everything had begun. A covert team was dispatched to locate him. Meanwhile, forensic specialists reopened the physical evidence, subjecting it to modern techniques unimaginable in the mid-1990s. Microscopic fibers. Trace DNA. Partial fingerprints once dismissed as unusable. Every fragment was re-examined under the unforgiving precision of 21st-century science. From beneath Emily's fingernails, they recovered minute traces of skin cells. At the time, the sample had been too degraded to analyze. Now, it yielded a partial genetic profile. Not enough for immediate identification, but sufficient to compare against known samples. Harper's DNA was collected. It did not match. The implication was chilling. Then came the fibers. Tiny strands of synthetic fabric embedded in the carpet, consistent with the type used in industrial work jackets. Bell's employment history revealed he had worn such garments during casual labor jobs. The pieces began to align, not neatly, but convincingly, forming a mosaic of probability that tightened with each discovery. 3 weeks after Harper's confession, police executed an arrest warrant in the pre-dawn hours, surrounding Bell's isolated dwelling in a haze of dust and headlights. He emerged slowly, hands raised, confusion flickering across his features before hardening into defiance. He denied everything, laughed at the accusations, claimed Harper was lying to save himself. But as detectives laid out the evidence, the fibers, the DNA, the decades of silence, Bell's bravado faltered. During interrogation, his composure unraveled. He contradicted himself repeatedly, claimed not to know Emily, then admitted seeing her once, claimed to have been alone, then faltered when confronted with pub receipts, witness statements, and surveillance images placing him with Harper that night. The walls closed in. The story he had rehearsed for 20 years collapsed under the weight of detail. And yet, the most devastating moment came not from confrontation, but from a single photograph. Emily, smiling, taken months before her death. When it slid across the table, Bell's eyes fixed upon it, unblinking, for a long, unbearable moment. His jaw clenched, his breath shuddered, and for the first time, something resembling regret flickered across his face. He did not confess outright, but he no longer denied being there. The case exploded back into public consciousness. Headlines screamed of betrayal, of long-buried secrets, of a cold case finally cracking open. Emily's family, summoned to police headquarters, listened in stunned silence as detectives laid out the evidence, the confession, the arrest. Tears flowed. Hands trembled. Hope and horror tangled together in a suffocating embrace. After 19 years, they were closer than ever to answers, yet the proximity of truth reopened wounds they had spent lifetimes trying to close. For Harper, cooperation became his fragile lifeline. In exchange for leniency, he guided investigators through every detail he could recall, walking them step by step through the night, mapping movements, reconstructing positions, reliving moments he had tried desperately to forget. Each retelling chipped away at his defenses, leaving behind a man hollowed by guilt and fear, trapped in a purgatory of memory. He spoke of the sound of rain against the window, of the way Emily's voice cracked when she told him to leave, of Bell's sudden, violent intrusion, of the moment everything slipped beyond control, and of the silence that followed, vast and merciless. But even as the narrative solidified, one question continued to haunt the investigation. Why had Harper waited 19 years to speak? What force had finally shattered his resolve? The answer, when it emerged, was as tragic as it was inevitable. In the months preceding the anonymous call, Harper had been diagnosed with an aggressive neurological disorder. His prognosis was uncertain, his future unstable. The walls of his carefully constructed denial had begun to crumble under the pressure of mortality. Dreams invaded his sleep. Flashbacks erupted without warning. The night of Emily's death replayed itself endlessly until the line between past and present dissolved. Confronted with the possibility that he might carry the secret to his grave, Harper broke. Not out of courage, not out of redemption, but out of terror. And so the cold case, dormant for nearly 2 decades, roared back to life, propelled by the fragile confession of a man standing at the edge of his own extinction. But justice, long delayed, is rarely simple. Because as prosecutors prepared to build their case, as defense attorneys sharpened their strategies, as the city braced for a trial that would resurrect every grim detail, a final revelation loomed, one that would complicate everything, one that would force investigators to confront the possibility that the truth, even now, was still incomplete. The machinery of justice lurched into motion with brutal momentum, court dates scheduled, legal teams assembled, media vans staking out sidewalks before sunrise, the quiet weight of 19 lost years compressing into a single, fevered present, and yet, beneath the apparent clarity of confession and arrest, a fault line began to emerge, subtle at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. As investigators realized that the truth they were chasing was not a straight road, but a labyrinth. And somewhere deep inside it, a final secret waited, coiled and patient. The prosecution built its case methodically. Harper's testimony was dissected, reconstructed, reinforced with forensic evidence and circumstantial support. Bell's history of violence, his proximity to the scene, the fibers, the DNA, the timeline, each element tightened the noose. But the defense struck back with equal ferocity, attacking Harper's credibility, painting him as a desperate man seeking to escape responsibility, a witness poisoned by fear and illness, whose shifting narratives revealed not honesty, but self-preservation. They argued contamination of evidence, degradation of memory, the unreliability of confessions shaped by suggestion and guilt. In the battle between certainty and doubt, nothing was simple. As hearings progressed, journalists unearthed details long buried. Old classmates were interviewed. Former neighbors came forward. Fragments of Emily's life resurfaced, stitched together across news segments and online forums. Each story added color, warmth, and unbearable poignancy, reminding the public that behind every forensic detail lay a human being who had laughed, dreamed, and loved. Candlelight vigils reappeared on her old street. Flowers crowded the footpath. Strangers paused, heads bowed. Strangers to grief, yet united by it. But in the midst of this collective reckoning, a new anomaly emerged. A forensic analyst, revisiting the DNA profile recovered from beneath Emily's fingernails, noticed a faint irregularity, a secondary trace previously dismissed as contamination. Advanced sequencing techniques isolated a fragment, partial and degraded, yet distinct enough to suggest the presence of a third genetic contributor. Not Harper, not Bell, someone else. The discovery sent a tremor through the task force. Was this the result of innocent contact? A casual brush against a coworker? A forgotten handshake? Or did it indicate something far more unsettling? A third participant unseen, unaccounted for, whose involvement had never been suspected. Investigators plunged back into the past, reconstructing Emily's final days with microscopic precision. They retraced her movements, mapped her interactions, reviewed her phone logs, her emails, her handwritten notes. They scrutinized cafe rosters, university attendance records, public transport footage. Names accumulated. Faces reappeared. Patterns flickered, then vanished. Among these fragments, one detail began to glow with unnatural intensity. 3 days before her death, Emily had missed a scheduled study group meeting, something she had never done before. When asked, she had brushed it off, claiming she felt unwell. But a friend recalled she seemed distracted afterward, unsettled, as though carrying a weight she did not want to share. Another friend remembered a brief argument in the cafe, a tense exchange between Emily and a man she did not recognize, his voice low, urgent, his body language aggressive. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now, it pulsed with possibility. CCTV footage from the cafe was recovered, grainy and incomplete, but enough to reveal a tall figure in a dark jacket leaning across the counter, his face partially obscured by shadow and low resolution. He gestured sharply. Emily stepped back, her smile gone, her posture rigid. The encounter lasted less than a minute. Then the man left, vanishing into the blur of lunchtime crowds. The image was broadcast nationwide. Tips surged in. Most were useless. Some were malicious. A handful were unsettling. But one, in particular, stopped investigators cold. A former delivery driver recognized the man. He identified him as Adrian Cole, a contract courier who had worked sporadically in the area during the mid-1990s. Cole had been dismissed from multiple jobs for volatile behavior, verbal aggression, and at least one reported incident of stalking a female coworker. His name did not appear in the original case files. He had slipped through the net entirely. Tracking Cole's movements proved difficult. His employment history was fragmented, his addresses transient, his life a trail of temporary rooms and broken connections. Eventually, records placed him in Queensland, working briefly at a shipping yard before disappearing again. No stable phone number. No consistent contacts. A ghost threaded through bureaucratic apps. Detectives followed the faint trail, interviewing former colleagues, neighbors, acquaintances. Stories emerged of unpredictable outbursts, obsessive fixations, sudden disappearances. One woman described months of unwanted attention, relentless messages, threats thinly veiled as affection. Another recalled a violent argument in a parking lot, ending only when bystanders intervened. The pattern was unmistakable. As the net tightened, the prosecution faced an agonizing dilemma. If a third man had been present that night, the entire framework of the case could collapse. Harper's confession, Bell's arrest, the fragile architecture of justice they had built, all stood on the assumption of two participants. Introducing a third threatened to fracture everything. But to ignore the possibility would be to betray the very truth they sought. Then, in a stroke of grim coincidence, Adrian Cole resurfaced. He was arrested on unrelated assault charges in a remote mining town nearly 3,000 kilometers from Sydney. When detectives arrived to question him, they were struck by his immediate defensiveness, the hostility that radiated from him like heat. He denied ever knowing Emily Carter, denied working in Sydney in 1996, denied everything. But records told a different story. Employment logs placed him in the cafe's delivery rotation that year. Transit data placed him near Emily's neighborhood multiple times in the months preceding her death. And when his DNA was collected, the partial match to the secondary trace from Emily's fingernails ignited like a fuse. Confronted with the evidence, Cole's demeanor shifted, not to remorse, not to fear, but to fury. He accused police of fabrication, accused Harper of deception, accused Bell of betrayal. He claimed the DNA was coincidence, contamination, a conspiracy engineered to bury him beneath a crime he had not committed. His voice rose. His fists clenched, his restraint frayed. And then, in a moment of reckless defiance, he let slip a detail no innocent man could know. He described the broken phone. The room went silent. It was not a detail released to the public, not mentioned in press conferences, not included in court documents. It existed only in sealed reports and the memories of those who had stood inside that bedroom. The words hung in the air, undeniable, irrevocable. Cole froze. For a second, the mask dropped, revealing something raw beneath. Fear, realization, the sudden understanding that the story he had built was unraveling. He clamped his mouth shut, refusing to answer further questions, demanding a lawyer. But the damage was done. Investigators now faced a staggering possibility. That night, in that small, unremarkable house, 3 men had converged around a single young woman, each carrying his own storm of need, anger, and obsession. That violence had not erupted from a single blow, a single motive, but from a volatile collision of lives, each amplifying the chaos of the others, until control shattered completely. The cold case was no longer a straight line from victim to killer. It was a web. And every strand led deeper into darkness. The revelation of a third presence detonated like a seismic charge beneath the investigation, sending fractures through every assumption, every carefully constructed narrative, forcing detectives, prosecutors, and families alike to confront a reality far more harrowing than they had imagined, because the truth, it seemed, was not merely hidden, but deliberately entangled, wrapped in layers of fear, deception, and mutual destruction, each participant bound to the others by a shared catastrophe. None of them had truly escaped. With Adrian Cole now in custody, the task force expanded, resources flooding back into a case that had once been abandoned to time. Interrogation schedules were rewritten. Evidence queues lengthened. Timelines splintered into branching possibilities. And at the center of it all stood the fragile axis of 3 men, each claiming a version of the night, each pointing away from himself, each bound to the same brutal outcome. Harper's testimony shifted once more under pressure. Confronted with the evidence implicating Cole, he faltered, then unraveled. He admitted recognizing Cole from the cafe, admitted seeing him earlier that evening near Emily's street, but insisted he had not known Cole would follow them inside. His memory blurred at critical moments, his certainty dissolving into fear and confusion. Investigators saw not only deception, but trauma, the kind that fractures recollection, leaving behind jagged shards rather than coherent narrative. Bell, meanwhile, retreated into silence, his lawyer advising him to speak no further. But in the isolation of his cell, cracks appeared. Guards reported restless pacing, muttered arguments with invisible opponents, nights punctuated by sudden outbursts of anger or despair. When he finally agreed to a monitored interview, his voice was brittle, his words sharp, as though sharpened by years of rehearsed bitterness. He accused Harper of manipulation, accused Cole of obsession, painted himself as the reluctant witness, the man trapped between two unstable forces. According to Bell, it was Harper who had initiated contact with Emily, Harper who had engineered the confrontation, and Cole who had escalated it into violence. Bell cast himself as the bystander, the coward, the man who fled rather than intervene. It was a story designed to minimize culpability, yet within it lurked fragments of disturbing plausibility. Cole's version was more defiant, more volatile. He denied entering the house, denied any direct contact with Emily that night. He admitted to confronting her days earlier, claiming she owed him money for deliveries, a claim unsubstantiated by records. He framed Harper and Bell as conspirators, men who had dragged his name into their guilt. But when pressed, his composure slipped, revealing flashes of rage and contempt that chilled the room. 3 stories, 1 body, and a night that refused to surrender its secrets. To break the deadlock, investigators returned again to the physical scene, reconstructing it with forensic precision. Using modern 3D modeling, they mapped the trajectory of movement within the house, tracing paths of entry, points of struggle, angles of impact. Blood spatter analysis suggested multiple blows from different directions, inconsistent with a single assailant. Bruising patterns indicated restraint, fingers digging into flesh, perhaps more than one set of hands. The shattered phone lay near the foot of the bed, but fracture patterns implied it had been thrown against the wall before hitting the floor, an act of fury rather than panic. The evidence whispered of chaos, of overlapping intentions, of a confrontation that spiraled beyond any one person's control. Then, in a final attempt to pierce the veil of denial, prosecutors arranged a series of controlled confrontations, allowing the 3 men to observe portions of each other's statements, carefully curated, strategically incomplete, designed to provoke reaction rather than resolution. Harper watched footage of Bell describing him as the instigator. His face contorted, shame and fury colliding. He slammed his fist against the table, shouting that Bell was lying, that he had tried to stop it, that he had begged them to leave. Bell, in turn, reacted violently to Cole's denials, hurling curses, accusing him of cowardice, of hiding behind lawyers and lies. Cole's response was chillingly calm, a thin smile curling at the corners of his mouth as he dismissed them both as weak, as men too frightened to own their darkness. The room seemed to pulse with antagonism, decades of suppressed hostility erupting in jagged bursts. But it was a small detail, easily overlooked, that finally tipped the balance. A forensic technician, combing through the original evidence boxes for the 100th time, discovered a fragment of fabric caught in the metal hinge of the back door, preserved only because it had lodged in an inaccessible crevice. Advanced microscopy identified it as part of a distinctive courier uniform, one issued exclusively by a now-defunct delivery company. Employment records confirmed that in 1996, only a handful of couriers in the area wore that uniform. Adrian Cole was one of them. The fragment became the fulcrum upon which the case pivoted. Confronted with it, Cole's defiance collapsed. The mask of indifference cracked, revealing panic beneath. His lawyer urged silence, but Cole, cornered by physical evidence and his own fatal slip, began to unravel. He admitted to following Harper to Emily's house, admitted to entering uninvited, admitted to shouting, to grabbing, to losing control. But he maintained that the fatal blow had been struck by Bell, that he had merely watched in shock as everything disintegrated. Bell, when presented with Cole's partial confession, erupted in fury, accusing him of cowardice, of rewriting history. He claimed Cole had attacked Emily in a jealous rage, that he, Bell, had tried to pull him away. Harper, caught between them, wept openly, his narrative dissolving into fragments of terror and regret. 3 men, 3 confessions, 3 attempts to survive. The truth lay somewhere in the intersection of their lies. Prosecutors faced an excruciating decision. Charging all 3 risked diluting responsibility, confusing jurors, and allowing reasonable doubt to fester. Charging only one risked condemning the wrong man. In the end, they chose a path as complex as the crime itself. Bell and Cole were charged with murder, Harper with manslaughter and obstruction of justice, reflecting his presence, his silence, and his role in concealing the crime. The city held its breath as the trial date approached. For Emily's family, the legal maneuvers blurred into a haze of grief and exhaustion. They attended hearings, listened to forensic testimony, watched strangers debate their daughter's final moments with clinical detachment. Each detail reopened the wound. Each photograph, each diagram, each reconstruction etched new scars into memory. And yet, beneath the pain, a singular desire burned, to know, finally, how and why. The courtroom filled to capacity on the first day of testimony. Reporters packed the benches. Cameras waited outside, lenses poised to capture every flicker of emotion. As the defendants were led in, the air thickened with anticipation and dread. Harper walked with head bowed, his body diminished, as though years of suppressed guilt had finally compressed him. Bell strode in rigid defiance, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the room for threats. Cole entered last, gaze cold, expression unreadable, the faintest hint of contempt curling his lips. 3 lives, converging once more around a single, irrevocable truth. And as the proceedings began, as the first witness took the stand, as the machinery of justice ground forward, it became clear that the verdict, whatever it would be, could never truly untangle the devastation of that night. Because some crimes do not end when the killing stops. They echo. They metastasize. They burrow into the fabric of time, staining everything that follows. And in the shadow of that small house in Sydney, the past was about to demand its final reckoning. The courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a pressure chamber, sealed, airless, every breath heavy with anticipation, as the prosecution began to dismantle the last remaining defenses of silence and denial, layer by layer, detail by detail, reconstructing a night that had long resisted explanation, a night now forced into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny, where no shadow could remain untouched. The first witnesses were forensic specialists, their voices calm, precise, methodical, each sentence a scalpel cutting through conjecture, exposing raw fact. They spoke of blood patterns that told a story of movement, of impact angles that suggested multiple assailants, of bruising consistent with restraint rather than a single strike. 3-dimensional reconstructions rotated slowly on courtroom screens, mapping the violent choreography of the final moments, the geometry of chaos translated into clinical certainty. Jurors leaned forward, eyes fixed, absorbing the transformation of tragedy into data. Then came the DNA evidence. Experts explained degradation, partial profiles, probability thresholds, the science that had advanced far beyond the limits of 1996. They described how the secondary trace, once dismissed as noise, now spoke with unmistakable clarity, linking Adrienne Cole to direct physical contact with the victim in the moments before her death. The defense objected. The judge overruled. And the truth pressed onward. When Harper took the stand, the room seemed to contract around him. He appeared smaller than in police custody, shoulders slumped, skin pallid, eyes rimmed red by sleepless nights. His voice trembled as he recounted the events, the words stumbling forward, weighted by guilt and fear. He described the pub, the walk, the knock on the door, the argument that spiraled into terror. He spoke of Bell's intrusion, of Cole's sudden appearance, of confusion erupting into violence. And when he reached the moment of Emily's death, his voice fractured, dissolving into silence broken only by sobs that echoed through the chamber. Under cross-examination, the defense tore into him, exposing inconsistencies, contradictions, omissions. They painted him as a liar, a manipulator, a coward who had hidden behind the shadows of two more volatile men. Harper did not resist. He accepted the accusations, his eyes hollow, his nod slow. He admitted his failures, his fear, his complicity through silence. He did not seek absolution, only release. Bell's testimony followed, and with it, a chilling shift in atmosphere. Where Harper had appeared broken, Bell radiated controlled hostility. His gaze was defiant, his posture rigid, his words clipped. He denied striking the fatal blow, denied orchestrating the violence, cast himself as a witness swept into catastrophe by forces beyond his control. Yet, beneath the surface, anger simmered, erupting in sharp bursts when pressed. His recollections were precise where they served him, vague where they did not. The jury watched, uneasy, sensing calculation beneath the bravado. Cole's turn was the most volatile. He entered the witness box with a cold composure that unsettled even seasoned observers. His denial was absolute, his disdain thinly veiled. He accused investigators of conspiracy, witnesses of betrayal, the system of injustice. But when confronted with the fabric fragment, the DNA, the CCTV footage, his control wavered. His voice sharpened. His breathing quickened. And in a moment of unguarded fury, he slammed his hand against the rail, shouting that none of them would have been there if Emily had simply listened. The room froze. The implication hung heavy, unmistakable, a flash of entitlement, of rage, of a worldview where blame flowed outward, never inward. The defense scrambled to contain the damage, but the words lingered, etched into the consciousness of every juror. As testimony unfolded, the narrative sharpened into a harrowing convergence. Harper's infatuation, Bell's volatility, Cole's obsession. Three unstable trajectories intersecting within the confined space of a single home, amplifying one another, escalating beyond restraint. What began as confrontation metastasized into violence, the presence of multiple aggressors transforming tension into fatal chaos. And yet, even with mounting evidence, the precise sequence of events remained elusive. Who struck first? Who delivered the final blow? Who held Emily down? Who shattered the phone? Each question splintered into possibility, each answer refracted through the prism of self-preservation. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, clutching candles, photographs, handwritten signs. Emily's face, frozen in youth, gazed out from posters taped to barricades, a silent witness to the spectacle of justice unfolding in her name. The media dissected every development, commentators parsing tone, gesture, nuance, searching for certainty where none fully existed. The city held its breath. For Emily's parents, the trial was a relentless ordeal. They sat through graphic testimony, through forensic images, through the dissection of their daughter's final moments, each revelation another incision. Her mother gripped a folded tissue, knuckles white, as if clinging to the fragile barrier between memory and collapse. Her father stared forward, unmoving, absorbing pain in silence, his grief too vast for display. And still, the questions persisted. Why had Emily opened the door? Did she recognize the danger? Did she believe she could de-escalate? Did she sense, even briefly, the storm gathering beyond her threshold? Witnesses spoke of her kindness, her empathy, her tendency to trust. She had been the friend who listened, the coworker who covered shifts, the student who shared notes. Compassion, in her world, was not a risk. It was a reflex. That reflex, the prosecution argued, had placed her directly in harm's path. As the trial progressed, a pattern emerged, not of a singular villain, but of collective failure. A convergence of weakness, obsession, rage, and fear, each feeding the other, until restraint dissolved completely. Responsibility blurred, yet culpability sharpened, crystallizing around the undeniable reality that 3 men had entered her life that night, and none had left her alive. In closing arguments, the prosecution did not seek simplicity. They did not attempt to crown a lone monster. Instead, they painted a portrait of shared destruction, of a tragedy born from intersecting flaws, each defendant accountable for his role, each complicit in the outcome. Justice, they argued, was not about isolating a single hand, but acknowledging the collective force that had extinguished a life. The defense countered with fragmentation, doubt, the erosion of memory, the impossibility of certainty after decades of silence. They warned against the seduction of narrative, the human impulse to impose order upon chaos, to seek meaning where randomness might reign. They urged jurors to resist emotion, to cling to reasonable doubt, to remember that the burden of proof rested heavy, unyielding, upon the state. The jury retired to deliberate. Hours stretched into days. Outside, rain fell in soft sheets, mirroring the night that had begun everything, as if the city itself mourned, suspended once more in that unresolved moment. Inside the deliberation room, 12 strangers grappled with the unbearable weight of judgment, with the knowledge that their decision would echo across lifetimes. On the 4th evening, they returned. The courtroom stood. Silence pressed in. The foreperson's voice, when it came, was steady, but carried the tremor of consequence. The verdicts would reshape the lives of 3 men, redefine a family's grief, and finally, irrevocably, close a chapter that had remained open for nearly 20 years. But even as justice prepared to speak, a deeper truth loomed, one that no sentence could erase, one that would linger long after the echoes of the gavel faded. Because in the end, no verdict could restore what had been taken, and no closure could fully silence the night. The courtroom seemed to contract as the verdicts were read, the air thickening, every breath suspended in the narrow space between past and present, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to listen, and when the foreperson spoke, the words cut through the silence with surgical precision, slicing decades of uncertainty into stark, irreversible fact. Marcus Bell was found guilty of murder. Adrian Cole was found guilty of murder. Daniel Harper was found guilty of manslaughter and obstruction of justice. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Not relief, not triumph, but a fragile release, the loosening of a knot that had tightened for 19 years. Emily's mother closed her eyes, tears slipping free. Her father lowered his head, hands clasped, shoulders trembling. Around them, strangers wept, journalists scribbled, cameras flashed, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that the endless question, the relentless why, had finally been answered, even if the answer itself brought no comfort. The judge's voice followed, measured, solemn, as sentences were pronounced. Life imprisonment for Bell and Cole, minimum term set in stone. Harper received a lengthy custodial sentence, tempered by his cooperation, yet heavy enough to mark his role in the catastrophe. The gavel struck, echoing like a gunshot, sealing their fates. As the defendants were led away, Bell twisted once, eyes blazing with hatred, scanning the gallery until they locked onto Harper. For a fraction of a second, something primal flickered between them. Accusation, betrayal, shared ruin. Cole did not look back. His gaze remained fixed forward, jaw clenched, as if refusing to acknowledge the world he had helped destroy. Harper stumbled, his composure finally collapsing, sobs racking his frame, the weight of 19 years crashing down all at once. Outside, rain began to fall. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, voices overlapping in a cacophony of demands, but Emily's family moved silently through the chaos, shielded by officers, their faces carved by exhaustion and grief. The justice they had sought for nearly 2 decades had arrived, yet it felt less like victory and more like the closing of a wound that could never truly heal. In the weeks that followed, Sydney exhaled. The case that had haunted the city receded from headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies, newer fears. But beneath the surface, its imprint lingered. Conversations turned inward. Parents hugged children tighter. Doors were locked more carefully. Trust, once broken, took time to mend. For Emily's friends, the verdicts brought a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. They gathered at her grave, leaving flowers, photographs, handwritten notes, each message a fragment of a life interrupted. They spoke of what she might have become: a teacher, a writer, a traveler, a mother. They laughed through tears, recalling her humor, her kindness, the small quirks that made her unforgettable. And in the quiet spaces between words, they mourned not only her death, but the decades of life stolen from her. Daniel Harper began serving his sentence in a low-security medical facility, his neurological condition deteriorating steadily. Those who interacted with him described a man stripped of pretense, consumed by remorse, haunted by visions he could no longer suppress. He wrote letters to Emily's family, never mailed, never shared, pages filled with apology, confession, and self-reproach. He spoke often of that night, not to absolve himself, but as if repetition might somehow dilute the pain. It never did. Bell and Cole were transferred to maximum security prisons, their lives reduced to rigid routine and endless confinement. Bell's aggression followed him inside, earning isolation, disciplinary sanctions, a reputation that hardened with each passing year. Cole retreated inward, avoiding confrontation, cultivating silence, as though erasure were his final defense. Neither ever admitted full responsibility. Neither expressed genuine remorse. Their worlds narrowed to concrete walls and steel bars, echoes of a night they could never escape. Yet, for all the legal closure, something unsettled remained. Among investigators, a lingering unease persisted, a quiet acknowledgement that even the most exhaustive reconstruction could never fully capture the truth of that final hour. Memory was fallible. Testimony was filtered through fear and self-interest. Evidence, though powerful, could only sketch the outlines of chaos. The precise sequence, the exact moment where control shattered beyond repair, remained elusive, suspended forever in the shadows of that small bedroom. And perhaps, in the end, that ambiguity was the final cruelty of the crime. Years passed. Emily's parents moved from their home, unable to bear the weight of memories embedded in every wall. They settled in a coastal town, near the ocean, where the rhythm of waves offered a fragile semblance of peace. Her brother married, named his first daughter Emily, a living tribute, a promise that her name would endure. Life, stubborn and relentless, continued. But on the anniversary of her death, they returned. They stood once more on that quiet street, now transformed, the old house replaced by a modern duplex, its clean lines and bright windows offering no hint of the darkness that had once resided there. Children's laughter drifted from a nearby yard. A dog barked. Somewhere, music played. The world moved forward, oblivious. They placed flowers on the footpath. And for a long time, they said nothing. Because some stories, even when concluded, do not end. They linger. They echo in the spaces between moments, in the hush before sleep, in the sudden tightening of the chest when memory surges unbidden. They remind us that beneath the ordinary pulse of life, beneath routine and comfort, uncertainty waits, patient and unseen. The Sydney 1996 cold case had been solved. The arrests had shocked the community. The truth, long buried, had finally surfaced. Yet the shadow it cast stretched far beyond verdicts and sentences, into the fragile realm of trust, into the collective psyche of a city, into the quiet hearts of those who still whispered her name. And in that shadow, the question lingered, soft but relentless. How many other stories lay hidden, waiting for their moment to break the silence? Time moved forward, but the case refused to stay buried, its echoes resurfacing in unexpected ways, in late-night radio programs dissecting the psychology of silence, in university lectures on forensic breakthroughs, in whispered conversations among detectives who still felt the chill of that reopened file, because the story of Emily Carter had become more than a crime. It had become a warning, a reminder of how fragile certainty truly was, and how easily the truth could vanish into the folds of fear. New technology continued to reshape old investigations, and the Sydney 1996 case became a benchmark, cited again and again as proof that no secret was ever fully secure. Across the country, cold cases were reopened, dusty evidence boxes unsealed, forgotten witness statements reread. Families who had long surrendered hope felt a dangerous flutter in their chests. If Emily's truth could surface after 19 years, perhaps theirs could too. But for those who had lived inside the case, the aftershocks were deeply personal. Detective Inspector Michael Harris, who had led the reopened investigation, found himself waking at night, heart racing, the echo of Harper's confession replaying endlessly in his mind. He had worked hundreds of homicides across 3 decades, yet this one lingered, burrowing beneath professional detachment, because it had unfolded not as a hunt, but as a resurrection, a reminder that the past never truly slept. He returned often to the original case notes, searching for signs he might have missed, moments where intervention could have shifted fate. A scribbled line, a dismissed witness, a misinterpreted alibi. Each page felt like a quiet accusation. He knew the limitations of the era, the constraints of technology, the pressures of manpower, and yet, the sense of unfinished reckoning persisted, a phantom weight pressing against his chest. Harper's decline accelerated. His illness advanced relentlessly, eroding memory, distorting perception, fragmenting identity. In moments of lucidity, he clung to guilt like an anchor, repeating apologies to nurses, to guards, to strangers who had never known Emily, as though seeking absolution in sheer volume. At other times, he drifted, lost within hallucinated corridors of that long-ago night, whispering warnings to no one, recoiling from invisible shadows. When he died, alone in a sterile hospital room, his passing registered as a brief headline, a footnote to a far larger story. There were no mourners, no memorial, only a sealed envelope among his few possessions, addressed to Emily's family, containing a final confession, a full account of everything he remembered, every fear, every compromise, every moment of cowardice. The letter was never released publicly. It remained a private artifact of remorse, its contents known only to those who had lost the most. Bell adapted to prison with brutal efficiency, his violence earning both fear and isolation. Over time, he became a ghost within the system, transferred repeatedly, his presence leaving behind a trail of disciplinary reports and silent tension. He spoke rarely of the case, and when he did, it was with bitterness, insisting the world had conspired against him. Responsibility, in his vocabulary, was always external. Cole chose a different path. He retreated inward, severing contact with the outside world, refusing visits, declining interviews. His days became rituals of repetition, his nights consumed by silence. Guards described him as eerily calm, his gaze distant, his demeanor detached, as though the weight of the past had compressed him into something smaller, something hollow. But occasionally, in the deep hours before dawn, he would wake screaming, the sound echoing down concrete corridors, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed denial could fracture. Beyond prison walls, Emily's story embedded itself into collective memory. Documentaries retold it. Podcasts dissected it. True crime authors transformed it into narrative, shaping chaos into coherence, pain into structure. Her name became synonymous with unresolved grief, with the promise that truth, no matter how delayed, would eventually rise. Yet, for her family, public fascination offered little solace. They navigated life cautiously, guarding private memory against public consumption. Photographs once cherished became liabilities, their daughter's face endlessly reproduced, detached from the person she had been. They learned to answer questions with polite brevity, to deflect curiosity, to preserve a space where Emily existed not as a victim, but as a living presence, vibrant and whole. On quiet evenings, her mother still set an extra place at the table, a habit impossible to break. Her father tended a small garden, cultivating lavender and rosemary, the scents Emily had loved, allowing memory to bloom in fragile, tangible form. Her brother read bedtime stories to his daughter, weaving fragments of Emily's kindness into the fabric of a new generation, ensuring her spirit endured beyond tragedy. And yet, despite every attempt at healing, the question lingered. Not who had done it, but how it had been allowed to happen. Neighbors revisited the night endlessly, recalling distant sounds, fleeting shadows, moments dismissed too quickly. Each wondered whether a different choice, a faster call, a braver intervention, might have altered the outcome. The community carried a collective guilt, subtle but persistent, a sense that silence itself had been complicit. Years blurred. Sydney transformed once more, skylines shifting, neighborhoods reborn. The street where Emily had lived became unrecognizable, its past erased beneath modern architecture and polished concrete. Children who played there knew nothing of the violence that had once unfolded beneath their feet. Life, merciful and cruel, continued. But the case refused to fade completely. Every so often, a tip would arrive, a belated memory, a half-formed suspicion, a whisper of something more. Investigators logged each one, reviewed it carefully, then filed it away, knowing the story's central truth had already been laid bare. Still, the persistence of these echoes testified to the enduring power of unresolved fear. Because the Sydney 1996 cold case had not only revealed the mechanics of a crime, it had exposed the anatomy of silence. How fear spreads, how guilt metastasizes, how truth, when buried, does not die, but waits. And in that waiting, it reshapes lives, alters destinies, distorts time itself. As the years accumulated, Emily's name receded from headlines, yet her absence remained a quiet presence in the city's subconscious, a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary days, darkness could still gather, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. And somewhere, in the layered memory of Sydney, the echo of a single scream continued to reverberate, unanswered, unstoppable, a warning carried forward by time itself. Memory does not fade. It migrates. It changes shape, sinks into unexpected corners of the mind, waits in silence, and then, without warning, resurfaces, sharper than before. In Sydney, long after the courtrooms emptied and the headlines disappeared, the story of 1996 continued to pulse beneath the city's skin, embedded in the subconscious of a generation that had grown up under its shadow. Young detectives, fresh from the academy, studied the case as a cautionary tale. Professors lectured on its lessons, the cost of delayed testimony, the danger of dismissing fragile leads, the psychological labyrinth of fear and guilt. In training rooms, Emily's name became synonymous with the consequences of silence, her fate a silent instructor whispering through every file, every simulation, every exercise in restraint and judgment. Yet beyond academic dissection, the case settled into the daily lives of ordinary people. A woman crossing a dimly lit street paused before unlocking her door, listening for footsteps. A bartender refused to let a coworker walk home alone after midnight. Parents waited awake for the sound of keys in the door, hearts clenched until relief washed over them. None of these gestures bore Emily's name, yet all of them were shaped by her absence. The city learned caution. It learned vigilance. It learned that safety was not a given, but a fragile construct, sustained by awareness and collective responsibility. For Detective Harris, retirement brought no peace. He left the force quietly, without ceremony, exchanging his badge for long, solitary walks along the coast. The rhythm of waves offered temporary solace, but memory clung stubbornly, especially in the pre-dawn hours, when silence amplified thought. He replayed interviews, reconstructed timelines, imagined alternate paths. What if he had pushed harder in 1996? What if Harper's early inconsistencies had been interrogated more aggressively? What if Belle's alibi had been challenged? What if the cafe footage had been prioritized? The questions circled endlessly, an orbit of regret and longing. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in his garage, Harris discovered his original notebook from the case, its pages yellowed, edges curled. He sat on the concrete floor, reading faded ink, reliving the urgency, the frustration, the creeping dread as leads collapsed one by one. And in the margins, he found a single word scribbled repeatedly: listen. He closed the book, overcome by a sudden, suffocating clarity. The case had not failed because of malice or incompetence. It had failed because fear had drowned out fragile voices, because uncertainty had been easier to accept than discomfort, because the silence of witnesses had been allowed to harden into permanence. That realization haunted him. Across the city, Emily's brother navigated a different kind of reckoning. His daughter, now old enough to ask questions, had begun to wonder about the aunt whose name she carried. Photographs decorated her bedroom wall, a young woman laughing in sunlight, hair lifted by wind, eyes bright with promise. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the window, the child asked why her aunt never came to visit. He hesitated. Then, slowly, carefully, he told her the truth. Not the brutality, not the violence, but the loss, the love, the absence. He explained that Emily had been kind, that she had cared deeply for others, that she had believed in seeing the good in people. He spoke of her laughter, her stubborn optimism, her dreams. And as his daughter listened, wide-eyed, absorbing a story both beautiful and tragic, he felt a fragile peace take root, the knowledge that Emily's spirit would endure not only in memory, but in living hearts. Elsewhere, the case continued to ripple outward. A woman in Melbourne, haunted by a secret she had carried for decades, contacted police, her voice trembling as she described a violent incident she had witnessed as a teenager, one she had buried beneath fear and shame. In Brisbane, a man confessed to withholding information about a fatal hit-and-run years earlier, citing the Sydney case as the catalyst that shattered his silence. Across the country, confessions surfaced, not always solving crimes, but loosening the grip of guilt, releasing truths long suppressed. Emily's story became a mirror. In it, people glimpsed their own fears, their own compromises, their own moral crossroads. And some, finally, chose differently. But not all shadows retreated. Late one night, a detective working a routine shift received a call from a woman who claimed she had known Adrian Cole in the early 1990s. She spoke of obsession, of escalating threats, of a sense of impending violence she had never fully articulated. She had moved interstate, married, built a life, but the fear had never entirely faded. When she heard Cole's name on the news, her past surged forward, vivid and unrelenting. Her testimony reopened dormant files. Other women came forward, recounting encounters with Cole that skirted the edge of catastrophe. Each story shared the same pattern: fixation, control, sudden rage, then disappearance. The realization settled heavily among investigators that Emily might not have been an isolated target, but part of a broader constellation of near misses, of narrowly averted tragedies that had gone unrecognized. The thought was chilling. It suggested a universe of alternate outcomes, of parallel lives in which Emily survived, in which others did not. It underscored the randomness of survival, the arbitrary nature of fate. And in that recognition, a deeper sorrow took shape. Because it meant that Emily's death, while singular in its pain, was also emblematic, a symbol of countless untold stories, of dangers narrowly avoided, of lives altered by moments no one else ever witnessed. As years folded into decades, the case became legend, a modern cautionary tale whispered among students of criminology, a benchmark for investigative perseverance. Yet, stripped of myth and narrative, it remained, at its core, profoundly human. It was a story of longing, of loneliness, of fragile connections misinterpreted, of anger allowed to ferment, of fear elevated above compassion, of silence mistaken for safety, and of truth, relentless in its patience. On the 30th anniversary of Emily's death, a small memorial was erected near the site of her former home. It bore no graphic detail, no sensational language, only her name, her dates, and a simple inscription: Let silence never hide the truth again. People stopped. They read. They reflected. Some left flowers. Others touched the stone gently, as though greeting a stranger. And for a moment, the relentless pace of the city slowed, allowing memory to breathe. Because in the end, the Sydney 1996 cold case was not only about solving a murder. It was about confronting the cost of inaction. It was about recognizing the fragile boundary between fear and responsibility. It was about understanding that every voice, no matter how uncertain, carried the potential to alter destiny. And it was about honoring a life that had ended too soon by ensuring that its echo never faded into silence. Madrid, winter of 1997. A city glowing with lights, alive with movement and color, yet beneath that brilliant surface, a nightmare was about to unfold, one that would haunt Spain for nearly 3 decades. It was a cold, rainy night. The narrow stone streets shimmered under dim yellow street lamps. A young woman, Isabel Moreno, 26 years old, was walking home after a late shift at a small cafe in the Malesana district. Her coat pulled tight against the cold, she hurried through the empty streets, unaware that every step was carrying her closer to the final moments of her life. The next morning, her body was discovered in a narrow alley less than 300 meters from her apartment. The scene left even veteran investigators shaken. No witnesses. No murder weapon. No signs of forced entry. Only silence. And fear. Madrid awoke to headlines screaming of a brutal and senseless killing. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Bars closed early. Streets emptied faster after dark. A city once alive at night retreated into anxiety and suspicion. Inside the police station, detectives launched one of the largest investigations Madrid had seen in years. Hundreds of interviews. Thousands of tips. Endless dead ends. Yet every promising lead collapsed into nothing. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And slowly, the case faded into the shadows, buried beneath new crimes, new tragedies, and new victims. The murder of Isabel Moreno became known as the Madrid 1997 cold case, an open wound that refused to heal. Until one day, a single piece of forgotten evidence would resurface. And with it, a shocking truth that would stun the entire Spanish police force. The first officers arrived just before dawn, their footsteps echoing through the narrow alley as flashing blue lights splashed across wet stone walls, turning rain into shards of trembling color, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and cold concrete, and in that suffocating silence, the body of Isabel Moreno lay crumpled beside a trash container, one arm twisted unnaturally beneath her, her dark hair plastered to her face. Rainwater mixing with streaks of red that vanished into the gutter, a single shoe missing, the other barely clinging to her foot, as if she had tried to run, to fight, to escape, but never made it more than a few desperate steps. Veteran detectives stood frozen for several seconds before speaking, absorbing every detail, every shadow, every unnatural angle of her body, because instinct told them this was not a random act of violence, not a spontaneous outburst of rage, but something deliberate, something calculated, something far more chilling. The medical examiner would later confirm their suspicions. Isabel had been attacked from behind, dragged into the alley, and strangled with extreme force, the pressure so intense that small blood vessels in her eyes had burst, leaving behind a haunting crimson pattern, her defensive wounds telling a silent story of violent resistance, of fingernails digging into skin, of desperate gasps for breath swallowed by the night. Yet despite the brutality, the crime scene revealed a strange contradiction. There were no clear signs of sexual assault. No robbery.
No obvious motive.
Her purse lay nearby, untouched. Cash still inside. Jewelry still on her neck. The killer had taken nothing. Except her life. By mid-morning, the alley was sealed off with yellow tape, swarming with forensic teams, photographers, uniformed officers, and plainclothes detectives, each moving with a controlled urgency, knowing that the first hours were crucial, knowing that somewhere in Madrid, a killer was still breathing, still moving freely through the same streets as everyone else. Detective Inspector Javier Morales took command of the investigation, a man known for relentless focus and an instinct honed by years of chasing predators through the underbelly of the city, his eyes scanning the scene, memorizing every stain, every footprint, every discarded cigarette butt, because in his world, nothing was ever meaningless. He ordered an immediate canvass of the surrounding blocks. Every apartment, every bar, every shop. Dozens of officers spread out, knocking on doors, waking residents, asking the same questions again and again. Did you hear anything? Did you see anyone? Did anything seem out of place? Most answers were the same.
No.
Nothing. Just rain. Just silence. One elderly woman recalled hearing hurried footsteps around 2 a.m, but she could not say from which direction, or whether they were even connected to the crime. A taxi driver remembered dropping off a nervous-looking man nearby, but descriptions varied wildly, each memory blurring into uncertainty. The city offered fragments, but no truth. Inside Isabel's apartment, detectives found a life abruptly frozen in motion. A half-finished cup of tea sat cold on the kitchen counter. Her work uniform lay folded neatly on a chair. A small notebook rested on her bedside table, filled with phone numbers, shifts, reminders, ordinary details that now felt unbearably intimate, as if the walls themselves were mourning her absence. Her roommates described her as careful, cautious, not the type to wander into dark streets without reason, always texting when she arrived home safely, always aware of her surroundings, which only deepened the mystery of how someone had managed to catch her completely off guard. Investigators reconstructed her final evening minute by minute. Isabel finished her shift just after midnight. She chatted briefly with coworkers, stepped out into the rain, and began the short walk home. Surveillance cameras from nearby shops captured fragments of her journey, blurred images of her crossing intersections, pausing beneath awnings, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. The final frame showed her turning onto the narrow side street that led directly toward the alley where she would be found. And then, nothing.
No cameras. No witnesses.
No sound. A gap in time that swallowed her whole. Police searched relentlessly for physical evidence. Fibers. Fingerprints. DNA. They found partial shoe impressions in the mud, but heavy rainfall had washed away critical detail. A cigarette butt retrieved from a nearby drain yielded nothing useful. Fingernail scrapings revealed trace skin cells, but forensic technology in 1997 lacked the precision needed to generate a usable profile. Every promising discovery evaporated under scrutiny. Days stretched into weeks, pressure mounting as headlines demanded answers and fear tightened its grip on the city. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding photos of Isabel, demanding justice, chanting her name until it echoed through the streets like an accusation. Morales and his team chased every lead.
Ayele's ex-boyfriend.
A rejected admirer. A violent offender recently released from prison. Each suspect was interrogated, scrutinized, cross-checked, and eliminated. One man confessed during a drunken breakdown, only to recant hours later, his story unraveling under the weight of verifiable contradictions. Another matched a vague witness description but had been documented on surveillance footage miles away at the time of the murder. Every trail ended the same way, in silence. As months passed, the case began to take on a life of its own, morphing into urban legend, whispered about in bars and cafes, speculated on in late-night radio programs, each retelling adding new layers of fear, new theories, new villains lurking in the shadows. Some believed Isabel had been targeted by a stalker, someone who had followed her routines for weeks, learning her habits, waiting patiently for the perfect moment. Others argued it was a crime of opportunity, a predator roaming the streets, searching for vulnerability, striking once, then disappearing forever. Morales refused to accept either theory without proof. He pored over case files late into the night, scanning photographs until his vision blurred, replaying interviews in his head, searching for inconsistencies, for the smallest emotional crack that might reveal deception. But the city offered nothing. The killer remained invisible. By the end of the first year, official resources began to thin. New crimes demanded attention. New victims claimed urgency. The investigation slowed, its momentum fading, until the once frantic search became a quiet, methodical trudge through cold evidence. Isabel's family waited in anguish. Her mother kept her bedroom untouched, dusting the shelves, smoothing the bedspread, as if her daughter might return at any moment. Her father visited police headquarters weekly, sitting in the same chair, asking the same question, receiving the same gentle answer. No new leads. No new developments. The weight of not knowing became heavier than grief itself. Years passed. Detectives were reassigned. Files were boxed and archived. New officers joined the force, unaware of the case that had once dominated the city's attention. The alley where Isabel died was repainted, renovated, transformed into a quiet passageway once more, yet locals still crossed the street to avoid it, instinctively quickening their pace whenever they passed its entrance. The case officially became cold. But Morales never stopped thinking about it. He carried Isabel's photograph in his desk drawer, pulling it out during sleepless nights, studying her face, her smile, the life frozen forever at 26, reminding himself that somewhere, someone still knew the truth, still carried the memory of that night like a hidden scar. And deep within the sealed evidence boxes, among forgotten fibers and outdated lab reports, one tiny fragment waited in silence. A trace too small to matter in 1997. Too fragile to speak. Too incomplete to accuse. Yet destined, decades later, to ignite a chain reaction no one could foresee. Because science was evolving, and time, patient and relentless, was preparing to reopen a wound the city believed had finally begun to heal.